When the Almighty gave the Torah to the nation, he did it in the most perfect way. It was done in a unique way. It was done as a hybrid of a written Torah and an oral Torah. These are two parallel ways of teaching, of communicating, of codifying, of canonizing Torah. And it's unique in that you have two completely different systems that must match, or else, there's a problem. If your oral tradition that you receive from your teacher or your parent or your previous generation, if that conflicts with the written Torah, you have a problem. Conversely, if you try to just interpret your written Torah without the oral tradition, it will be incomprehensible. And thus, the two of them together, it made a perfect match for perfect instruction. And a lot of people ask the question, why is it so complicated? Can't you just write it all down? We'll fill up a whole bookcase and a whole library, and we'll have all the answers. And there's no risk of mistakes in the oral tradition and so on. It's a common question. And it's a legitimate question. And it's especially interesting when we find the verse in the Torah that tells us that the written Torah you must write down. And that is not to be taught orally. If you are teaching the written Torah and you're not reading from the text, you are violating this mitzvah. The written must be written. You must read it from written. You cannot just remember because you know by heart. You have to cite it from the source. Conversely, the oral Torah, you mustn't write down. That must remain the oral tradition. These two completely different but united systems must exist in the proper way that the Almighty designed, and you cannot try to fork it and say, oh, I'm kind of bright, so let me memorize the whole written Torah and I'll just read it. Who needs the Torah scroll? Who needs the Chumash to read it from? I'll just memorize it. No, that's a violation. Oh, I'm so clever. I'm so talented. I'll be able to organize and codify all of oral Torah, write it all down. That too is a violation. There's a prohibition. These two must remain distinct. And when you look at the sources give a bevy of reasons why this has to be the way it's done. And again, if the Almighty is going to do something, or when the Almighty does something, it's always going to be the most perfect way possible. And therefore, we, with our puny little brains, may think, well, there will be a better way to do it. And it's fair to ask the question, but the reality is that this is the absolute best way. And our sages have revealed to us many different reasons as to why this is a much better system. This is a much preferable system. So, for example, this is just obvious to anyone. If you learn about the founding of this republic and the very talented people that gathered together in Philadelphia to try to write down a constitution, these people, they were intelligent. They were very bright. And they spent a lot of time arguing and debating and philosophizing on government and how things work and checks and balances and the bicameral system and the three branches of government. They really thought these things very thoroughly. This was not just some patchwork job of some bureaucrat. The brightest minds all got together, representatives from all the different states got together to try to come up with the most perfect system. And they wrote a beautiful document. We have it. And it's in English. And what does it mean? No one seems to agree. And you have court cases. And we debate the constitutionality of all sorts of laws. And somehow the rulings are all 5-4 based upon which president appointed which justice. So we have a system today where very talented people worked assiduously to convey a system, a method in English. They wrote it all down, and it's not that long. It's not that comprehensive. You can kind of read it in an afternoon, probably a few times you can read in the afternoon. It's not long, and somehow, it's not perfect, as evidenced by the fact that the greatest legal minds seem to constantly disagree as to what the words even mean. So there are obvious flaws in the argument to say, just write it all down. A written text is very much subject to misinterpretation. It's similar to, there's different types of people. Some people like to listen. They're audio people. And some people like to read. I have a friend of mine who says, listen, I'm not going to listen to your podcasts, but I'll read your newsletters. I'm more of a reading kind of person. But if you have a discussion and then there's a transcript, that I find the transcript to be very dry. You don't hear the vocal inflections. You don't hear where the pitch goes up, the cadence of the talk. It's dry. And when there is oral instruction, and especially when it's done as a national a matter of great import, this is the most important thing that we have. We have the Almighty's Holy Torah, and He gave it to us, and He entrusted us to accurately perpetuate it. And this is the number one value of the nation. And the number one goal of the nation is to teach Torah to ourselves and to the next generation. This is something we take very seriously. And the idea you would just write it down and somehow 3,000 years later we'd still have some semblance of an idea of what the Almighty wanted, it's just preposterous. Now, the truth is, on an even more basic level, the Torah is infinite. So how do you write down infinite? You can't do it. And therefore, there's always going to be a limitation when you try to have a finite codification of something which is infinite. And there's lots of other reasons that our sages tell us. This is an example. If you ever had the great privilege of studying in the yeshiva, you'll have some discussions about cows and oxen. Why? Because the Torah tells us there's laws. The Talmud talks all about how you have damages. Your property damages someone else's property. And what is property? 2,000 years ago when they wrote down the Mishnah, well, it's my ox or my cow or my animal comes into your field and eats up all your food. Who has to pay? Do I have to pay? Where was it? Was it in a public domain, private domain? Maybe you should have had a fence, or maybe I should have guarded it, or maybe all sorts of different calculations and factors and variables. And that's great, but I don't know many people with cows. Some people do have cows, I know that. we know that. But I grew up and I didn't see a cow. We had no cows. And we had to study the laws of damages, and the examples that it gives are examples that maybe were more prevalent when these things were codified. And thus, this shows us that there's a certain dynamism that is lost when something is given an example, when something is portrayed in terms and using examples that are relevant to the time that it was written, that are contemporary to the time it was written. The Talmud doesn't talk about cyber security. It doesn't mention it. Why? Because that was not an idea. And therefore, if we're going to figure out the laws of cybersecurity, we have to take the laws that may be talking about cows or oxen or all sorts of other things and try to distill from that what the principle is, reverse engineer what the principle is, and that principle is indeed applicable to every possible situation. The best example maybe of this is the first book of Mishnah. We'll get to the Mishnah. This is the introduction of the introduction of the introduction. But the first book of Mishnah is the book of Brachos, which means blessings. And it's all about blessings. And all sorts of blessings. And we know, of course, there's blessings that you say for certain phenomena that you witness, for certain, the blessings we say in the morning, the blessings on foods and so on. There's many different types of blessings. And there are 6 different blessings for 6 different food categories. You make a blessing before you eat and after you eat. Well, some foods are not so simple. Do they fall into this blessing category or this blessing category? They kind of have arguments to endorse either option. Well, you look at the Talmud; it talks about all these foods, and no one knows what they are because they're not pizza or pasta. We don't know what they are, but it was common in the times of the Talmud that these were the foods that people ate. So the Talmud, when the Talmud wants to explain the different types of foods and food categories, they use as examples relevant to its time. And therefore, for us, we're disadvantaged because we have to take that example and reverse engineer the principle and apply it to our foods. So these are some of the ideas. Other ideas maybe are a bit surprising. The Almighty gave the Torah to us, to the Jewish nation, to us, and not to anyone else. And although it's true, the nation is told when they arrive into the land, they have to write the Torah in 70 languages on stones and then plaster it so that way everyone who comes, Jew and Gentile alike, can read and see what the laws of the land are. Now, how much was included? It's a debate. Was it just the Ten Commandments? Was it the whole Torah? But there's definitely room for instruction of Torah for everyone. That said, certainly parts of Torah are not to be publicized to other nations. And one of the ways that was maintained is, well, you got to come to the yeshiva. And it's not for everyone. And the Torah was not translated. We never translated the Torah. Ptolemy was very desirous of adding the Torah to his library. So he invited 70 sages. Come to Alexandria. Come for a sightseeing visit. Now you get the invitation, you got to show up, or else your head and your shoulders will be separated from each other. So they all show up. And he says, great, we got you all in the room. Now you're all going into separate rooms. And I'm not telling you ahead of what you're doing, but you're all going to translate the Torah into my language, into Greek. And you can't collaborate between yourselves because you're in all separate rooms. And indeed, the sages were forced to translate the Torah, and then he would just, you can't collude or collaborate with your colleagues. And that was his way to get the accurate translation of the Torah without any of this funny business, the Hebrew funny business. And the Talmud tells us that there were 36 changes that all the 72 sages agreed upon on their own. They all understood on their own. It's like a miracle. And these were not changes to the Torah. They were changes to the text of the Torah so that it's not misinterpreted. Meaning, it wasn't to change the interpretation of the Torah. It was actually to preserve the correct interpretation of the Torah, but the literal translation would have been misinterpreted. So they amended it in a way that the true interpretation would be understood. But that day is a day of mourning. It's a fast day in the Jewish calendar because there's a certain profaning of the Torah where this Greek king, emperor, demands that the Torah be translated for him, for his pleasure. The oral Torah, it's not in print. You got to come to the yeshiva for 14 years or 21 years to actually study it. It's safe. It's safe. You write it. And now it's available in French and Russian and English and all sorts of different languages. Well, it's a version of this where now the other part of Torah, or at least certain large parts of the other part of Torah, large parts of the oral Torah are now available to the world. And there's been a lot of grief and repression as a result of that. People take the Talmud online, all the anti-Semites, they're the experts in the Talmud, and they know exactly what it means, and they find all the objectionable parts, and that is used to fuel anti-Semitism, as we are aware. This is not what we want. You keep it oral, that's the intention. But certainly, if you have a system where everyone needs to know all of Torah, and the only way to do it is to study. You can't just go to your island with your Encyclopedia Talmudica, Encyclopedia Torahica, and study all of the Torah. You have to be involved in a community. You have to have a teacher. You have to be immersed in an environment to study. There's no other option. You have to do it all manually, and that ensures the vitality and the perpetuation of not just the ideas of Torah, but the values. And you have examples of great sages you could study from. It's a way to ensure that the fire of Torah is perpetuated from generation to generation. So there's all sorts of reasons, and there's many more, why it had to be like that. But as we know, if you go online, you could buy copies, written copies, codified, canonized copies of the oral Torah, or at least massive parts of the oral Torah. We have the Mishnah. That's written about the year 200 or so. No one knows exactly. It wasn't like they finished and said, okay, this day was done. It was generally around that time. We have the Talmud, Jerusalem Talmud, Babylonian Talmud. We have the halachic literature. And we know that this is prohibited. You cannot take the oral Torah and commit it to canonized writing. Indeed, there was a prohibition. It still is a prohibition. But the sages of that time, they waived the prohibition based upon a verse in Psalms. Eis la'asos laHashem. It's a time for action on behalf of God, because otherwise the Torah will be forgotten. Just as you would amputate a leg to save a person's life, even though under other circumstances that would be discouraged. Similarly, when the nation is at risk of forgetting the Torah, and the leaders of the nation, and the Sanhedrin, the authoritative body of the nation, they agree that Torah itself is at stake, even if it means violating a more minor prohibition to save the entire Torah, they must take action. And based upon that logic and that reason, the Mishnah was born. Now, what is the Mishnah? The Mishnah is the authoritative codification and canonization of the laws of the oral Torah. It's a book, really. It's 63 different books organized in 6 orders, the Shisha Sidarim, and this contains the complete authoritative laws of the oral Torah. It's very succinct, it's very terse, but it delineates all the laws. Now, we've spoken about this many times in the past. This was a monumental effort, organized, overseen by Rabbi Judah the Prince, who was the head of he was the president of the nation. He was a descendant of Hillel, descendant of King David. He was the greatest sage. He was the richest. He was connected politically to the Romans, and he's the architect of this massive project. And again, it's a very significant point in our history because it's a radical departure from the accepted practice up to that point. For 1,500 years, since Moshe, since Sinai, the oral Torah was never codified. It was never canonized. Yes, people kept private notes. It's important. People were allowed to keep private notes. But if you were teaching it, you must not use those notes, those written notes, for public instruction. You could have your own personal notes, but it's not a canon. That's not a codified corpus of law. It's your personal notes. No problem with that. When it comes to instruction, it must be oral. And again, Rabbi Judah the Prince, together with the Sanhedrin, together with all the sages, they understood that it was necessary to prevent the forgetting of the Torah. It's time to act to avoid the profaning of Torah. So we have 63 books in 6 general categories, and it is universally accepted as authoritative. Now, I was trying to be precise in my words. The Mishnah, it's not the full oral Torah. It's the canonization of the laws of oral Torah. The oral Torah itself contains a lot more than just the laws. You have, well, where do those laws, how do they trace their roots back to the written Torah? That's not necessarily in the Mishnah? What are the exceptions? What are the parameters? What are the various different cases where maybe some of those laws would be slightly different? So the Mishnah is thus an incomplete canon of the oral Torah. When they wrote it down, they still maintained large parts of the oral Torah were exclusively oral. And thus we have 3 centuries later, we have the publication of the Talmud. The Talmud is an elaboration of the Mishnah. It's not just the laws of the Mishnah. It's all the cases. It's all the source material. It's tracing it back to the written Torah. It's all the various offshoots of these particular laws, the different parameters of these laws, the exceptions to the laws, the debates spawned from these laws, and so on. And even though we have the Talmud, and it's enormous, and today it's published in 73 volumes, and that's just the Talmud, not the commentaries, and not the voluminous commentaries. When we talk about the Talmud, we talk about the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. It's a further canonization of oral Torah, but even with Talmud, there are massive parts of oral Torah that are still oral or not written. We have the Kabbalistic Torah, which is the hidden Torah. The hidden Torah remained and really remains hidden, not written down. We have the halacha. What's the halacha? Halacha is the practical behavior that a Jew must do to be in conformity with the laws of the Torah. Where do you find that? Well, technically, you can find all of that in the Talmud. But to do it properly, you need to be an expert in all of Talmud, written the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, and you have to know everything to be able to know the halacha. That was not written down. And thus, in the 1500 years since the sealing of the Talmud, many parts of the oral Torah were further canonized and codified. For example, we have the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, which was the first attempt to codify all of halacha in a systematic manner. We have the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, which is again a codification of the halacha of oral Torah. And even some of the Kabbalistic Torah was written down, like the Zohar, the writings of the Arizal, and so on. Now, this is a very brief overview of oral Torah. To discuss it properly and to, I guess, lay it out on a bookshelf properly, the amount of volumes you would need would fill libraries. But in our study of Torah 101, in our study of the foundations, the fundamental philosophical principles of Torah, we've covered many different aspects, many different angles of oral Torah and its codification. And today we begin maybe with the most ambitious of the classic pieces of Torah philosophy. We're trying to study the sources, and maybe the one we picked to begin today is the most comprehensive and sprawling of these sources. And that is Rambam's Introduction to Mishnah. So we have the Mishnah, Rabbi Judah the Prince, about the year 200. Almost 1,000 years later, we have a very significant personality, Rambam, Maimonides, and he wrote a commentary to Mishnah. It was the first commentary that went from the first of the 63 books all the way to the last. I covered it all. An absolutely massive work. And it was a very innovative work. When he wrote a commentary to the Mishnah, he also incorporated into his commentary some of the conclusions of the Talmud. It was written in a fascinating manner. It was written in Arabic. It was written for the people that he was living in lands that the primary tongue was Arabic. And he wrote it in Arabic, but he didn't want to write it in Arabic because then all the Arabic speakers can understand it. But if you write it in Hebrew, well, then the Jews wouldn't understand it. So he had a little bit of a pickle, a little dilemma, how to write his commentary to Mishnah. So he wrote it in Arabic, but with Hebrew letters. So the letters, the script is in Hebrew, but it doesn't spell any Hebrew words. It spells Arabic words. So you have to know both Arabic and Hebrew, and that's the way to ensure that it was understood by the intended audience and no one else. And in addition, there was another great innovation that he had, namely the use of introductions. In 3 places in this massive work, he has introductions. So we've seen already his introduction to the 10th chapter of the book of Sanhedrin, which is the chapter that talks about reward and punishment. And he has a very long introduction on the concepts of eschatology, reward and punishment, what happens after you die, and so on, the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, Olam Haba, the whole general concept of reward and punishment. Is doing a mitzvah with the anticipation of reward, is that even appropriate? The Almighty wants to do a mitzvah, and you say, well, what's in it for me? He has that whole discussion on whether we should do mitzvahs altruistically, or is that too much to ask, and so on. And he ends off that introduction with the 13 principles of faith. That's part of his commentary to Mishnah. It's an introduction to one of the chapters. There's another chapter, there's another book called Pirkei Avos, which is one of the books of Mishnah. And he offers an introduction to Pirkei Avos, which we've never studied yet. Maybe we'll get to it. It's called Shmona Prakim, the 8 chapters. And that's an introduction to the book of ethics. The biggest, largest, longest, most magisterial introduction is the introduction to Mishnah itself. And this is effectively a complete history, a philosophy, a methodology of oral Torah, and many other subjects. He talks about the history, the origin of oral Torah in times of Moshe, and in successive generations. He talks about the system of adjudication between disagreeing factions. You have a machlokas, you have a dispute. What do you do then? He has a very interesting note, we'll get to this today, about the inadmissibility of prophecy. You have a dispute. One sage says this, one sage says that. What are you going to do? Well, we have prophets. Let's just ask God. No, that doesn't work. Prophecy is inadmissible when it comes to adjudicating a halachic dispute. And then he segues to talk about prophecy in general. How does prophecy work? How do you determine the veracity of a prophecy claimant? And then he organizes the various parts of oral Torah, and he addresses at length the phenomenon of dispute, and he explains the organization and the sequencing of the books of the Mishnah. 63 books, why are they organized in that manner? We know it's 6 general categories and 6 orders of Mishnah, but why does it start with brachos, and why does it proceed to pay, and so on? He goes through all of them to explain the big picture logical flow of these 63 books. And then he addresses the further development of oral Torah, the further canonization of oral Torah, the books that expound upon the Mishnah. He chronicles the history of the oral Torah to the sealing of Talmud. He explains the purpose of the Talmud and so on. It's an absolutely fascinating piece. It's very long, and I'm excited to start it. Today, we'll start with the first part, and then we'll, please God, proceed with the ensuing parts. The first part is on the origin of oral Torah. And he starts off by saying like this, Da. Now, again, just to clarify, this was written originally in Arabic, but in the Rambam's lifetime, it was translated to Hebrew. So the translation that we use, or the Hebrew source that we use, is the original translation done in his lifetime. It's contemporaneous with the actual writing of this. He wrote it in Arabic. It was translated to Hebrew. And today you can find translations of it in English as well. You should know. Every mitzvah that the Almighty, that the Holy One, blessed is He, gave to Moshe, He gave it to it with its explanation. There was clarity in the original conveyance of Torah from God to Moshe. He would tell him the mitzvah, which is like the headline of the mitzvah, and then he would explain it, explain its details, explain its application. In every single mitzvah, Torah was like that. And then Moshe, when he would teach the Jewish people, he too would not just tell them the mitzvah, he would explain to them all the details, all the laws. And it was done in the following manner. He quotes the Talmud. The Talmud tells us that Moshe would receive the Torah from Hashem, from the Almighty, and he would start to teach. And he would teach to one person. He would teach it to Aaron. And once he taught it sufficiently well to Aaron, Aaron is no longer a student. He goes to sit to Moshe's right. And Aaron's sons, the two surviving sons, Elazar and Isamar, they enter. And Moshe teaches it again. This time to Aaron's sons, but Aaron's still present. He's sitting to Moshe's right. And after Aaron's sons, they hear the Torah of this particular mitzvah from Moshe, they sit to Moshe's left. And the 70 elders enter. There were 70 elders, unnamed elders, who were appointed by Moshe as to be the first version of the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is 71 sages. Well, Moshe's one plus 70. Those are the 70 sages. We read about their appointment in Parshas Behaloscha. They enter, and Moshe teaches for the third time what he taught to Aaron and what he taught to Aaron's sons. And finally, the entire nation is invited. Anyone who wants to come study can hear it from Moshe himself. So Aaron has now heard the Torah, or this particular piece of Torah, from Moshe 4 times. Aaron's sons, who joined after Aaron, they heard it 3 times. The elders heard it twice, and the nation heard it once. And then Moshe leaves. Moshe leaves, and now Aaron teaches. And then Aaron leaves. And then Aaron's sons teach. And then they leave. And then the elders teach. And then they leave. Everyone hears the Torah minimum of 4 times, but everyone has a different way of hearing it. Aaron hears it 4 times from Moshe. Aaron's sons hear it 3 times from Moshe, once from Aaron. The elders hear it twice from Moshe, once from Aaron, and once from Aaron's sons. And the entire nation hears it once from Moshe, once from Aaron, once from Aaron's sons, and once from the elders. And of course, there's lots of reasons why it was done like this, but this is the system that was in place at the original conveyance of the oral Torah. Now, after the teachings have been done, now it's time for the nation to discuss it. So amongst themselves, and together with the oversight of the elders, they would discuss it to make sure everyone knows it very clearly. By the way, the Talmud tells us from this is that when you want to study anything in the Torah, you got to do it a minimum of 4 times. That's the minimum. Of course, the more, the better. It's incomparable, someone who studies it 100 times with someone who studies it 101 times, but 4 is the minimum. And every person had the right to write down what you studied, to organize it for yourself in whatever language you want. This is your own personal notes, no problem. It's not for public consumption, but you're allowed to keep a file in a way that makes sense to you of what you studied. The nation was in the wilderness for 40 years. During those 40 years, all of their material needs were miraculously met. They had manna every morning. Clothes grew with them, we're told. They were enveloped by the clouds of glory. They drank water from a well embedded in a rock. What did they do with all their free time? They had lots of free time, and what they did is they studied day and night. This generation is known as the Dor Deya, the generation of knowledge. This was an unparalleled generation. That's fine. Yeah, with these noises going off over here. This was an unparalleled generation of Torah study. And this was applied to every single law. Just as the laws of Shemitah, our sages tell us, was taught at Sinai, not just the headline, the details, the most minute details, the general categories, and the more specific principles. All of them, all the laws taught to Moshe at Sinai and conveyed to the nation over the course of the 40 years. And then the Rambam cites an example. We have a verse in scripture that tells us, Basukos teshvu shivas yamim. In a sukkah. Well, what's a sukkah? We don't know. You sit in a sukkah for 7 days. That's a verse in scripture. And that's the headline of any mitzvahs, to sit in a sukkah for 7 days. Well, what does that mean? Well, the law tells us, the oral law tells us, it's for males, not females. Females can, not obligated to. Someone, God forbid, is sick. They can't be outside. They're not obligated. Someone is traveling. There's no sukkah. They're on the road. They're not obligated. Well, what is the sukkah made of? What are the walls made of? What is the schach made of? It has to go from the ground. But it cannot be tzemer umeshi, different materials. It can't be items. It can't be like products, even if it comes to the ground. If someone has like a blanket that's made out of some sort of material that goes from the ground, not usable for schach. Well, what must you do in the sukkah? You have to eat. You have to drink there. You have to sleep there. And what's the size? It has to be, the space of the sukkah must be a minimum of 7 handbreadths by 7 handbreadths. And how high could the sukkah be? Well, it can't be more than 20 amos. It can't be less than 10 tefachim. It can't be more than 20 cubits. It can't be less than 10 handbreadths. These are all the details. It doesn't mention it in the written Torah. It's part of the oral Torah. So Moshe gives them the headline and it gives them all the laws. And that's true with all the mitzvos. All 613 were conveyed in this manner. For 40 years, the nation is studying. At the end of the 40 years, it's the first of the month of Shvat. Moshe gathers the entire nation, and he tells them it's about the time, or it's nearing the time of my passing. We spent a lot of time studying together. Is there anything you forgot? Ask me and I will clarify. Is there anything that you maybe are uncertain about? Ask me and I will clarify. This is what we read about in the book of Devarim. Moshe began to clarify the Torah, to review it, to make sure that there is clarity in every part of it. Anyone who forgot a law, anyone who is uncertain about a law, come to Moshe. Now is the time. For 37 days, Moshe clarified the Torah. At the end of his life, the day of his passing, Moshe wrote 13 Torah scrolls, gave the Torah scrolls to each of the tribes. There are 13 tribes because you have Joseph is split into 2 and you have the tribe of Levi. Moshe wrote the entire Torah scroll from the first letter of Bereshis to the last letter of Le'ene Kol Yisrael, the last Lamed. Every tribe now had a Torah scroll written by Moshe, and thus completing their receipt of Torah. They spent 40 years receiving the Torah orally from Moshe, and now at the end of his life, they have the actual book, the actual scroll, the written Torah, has completed their acceptance of all the details of the Torah. Now, this is a very important point that's universally misunderstood. And no matter how many times we talk about it, it's still misunderstood. We always think, and it's not entirely inaccurately, we always think that, well, there's the written Torah, that's the source material, and then there's the oral Torah, which is the explanation of the written Torah. And that's sort of true, but if you think about it, the way the Rambam describes it to us, and really it's all sourced. The nation received the oral Torah before the written Torah. It wasn't like you start with the written Torah and then you deduce it. Like, how do we understand this? It's the opposite. It's the oral Torah comes first. For 40 years, there is no written Torah that was delivered to the nation, at least. And only at the very end, on the last day of Moshe's life, does every tribe receive a Torah scroll. And the truth is, with the Torah scroll itself, you can actually discover all the laws of the oral Torah. And it's very hard to do. But certainly, post facto, you can do that. But the written Torah and the oral Torah are the same. They're mirror images of each other. One is the encrypted version, one's the decrypted version, one's the encoded version, one is the decoded version, one is the lock, and one is the key that perfectly matches and unlocks it. Moshe got them both from heaven, gave us both written and oral Torahs. But the order was we first got the oral Torah, and then the written Torah. On the seventh day of the month of Adar, Moshe ascended Har Nevo, Mount Nebo. And what happened to him, the Rambam tells us, is something that we call death. Because he's no longer with us, and we remember him in the past. So we could call it death, but for him it was life. Him it wasn't death. Because he ascended to the appropriate level and designation in heaven that was fitting for him. And he quotes the Talmud, Moshe didn't die. We think of death as someone just dying and this violent almost separation of body and soul. That wasn't Moshe. Moshe seamlessly transitioned to heaven, and he's in heaven serving God as he did over here, just without any of the limitations and inhibitions of the physical world. And the Rambam kind of throws that in there. Moshe passed, but don't call it death. It's really life. And then he says, and the matter is, the explanation of this is very long. We're not going to talk about it right now. The Rambam he does this a lot in his writings, especially in these sorts of introductions. He says, well, now is not the time to talk about this. Or he says the opposite. Now is the time to talk about this, as we shall see. When Moshe passed, well, the nation is not leaderless. We have Joshua, his appointed successor. We have those elders, that body, that Sanhedrin, that serves as the spiritual and Torah and religious center of the nation. And they were well trained and prepared for the task before them by Moshe, and there really isn't dispute. Because we have the Torah, written Torah, we have the oral Torah, and we have Moshe did a very good job in teaching it to us. And we also have the methods of deriving the oral Torah from the written Torah, known as the 13 methods of derivation. The 13 ways by which we can study the written Torah and deduce some of the subtleties. We can decrypt, as we mentioned earlier, we can decrypt the written Torah. And yes, some matters were unclear. Some matters are contested. Some things were debated, as is to be expected. And what to do when there is a dispute, there is a system to adjudicate it. When there's a machlokas, when there's a dispute, you follow the rove, you follow the majority. You go to the Sanhedrin, we have that body, the greatest sages, and there's a vote. And that is already enshrined in the Torah. Disputes can be easily and quickly clarified. And then he drops the bomb, and he says, if there is a dispute, prophecy will not help you. Vidal, just read it to you in Hebrew. Shanavua, prophecy, Eina Mo'ila, does not help to explain the Torah. What Joshua and the elders and Pinchas were doing in Torah study is what the sages wrote the Talmud many, many centuries later, 1,800 years later. The sages, Abaya and Rava and Ravina, Ravashi, they studied in the same way. You have to use your brains. You cannot summon some sort of heavenly trump card to say, "Oh, I'm gonna discuss this with God. I'm going to summon prophecy and find the authoritative answer." That is not admissible. And then he ends off. This is where we'll stop. Here, he ends off and says, "Well, if prophecy cannot be used to clarify matters of Torah that are subject to dispute, so what benefit is there in prophecy? He says, oh, there's a lot of benefit. There's a lot of benefit that we receive from prophets and prophecy. And prophets and prophecy help us in understanding Torah. And now's the time that I'll explain it to you. And then he proceeds with an enormous exploration of prophecy and prophets and how do you determine the legitimacy and veracity of a prophet and different types of prophecies and so on. Real prophets, fraudulent prophets, prophets of idolatry, God forbid, false prophets. It's an enormous exploration of that. And then he says, unlike with Moshe and what happened when he died, it's not the time to talk about it. He says over here, now it is the time to talk about prophecy. And in part 2 of our study of Rambam's fascinating, sprawling, and magisterial introduction to the Mishnah, to his commentary to the Mishnah, we're going to study what he says about prophecy. How do you determine if a prophet is telling the truth? How do you verify and vet prophets? What happens if someone is a false prophet? Different types of false prophets. What happens if a prophet tells us to do something which is against the Torah, which creates all sorts of problems? Elijah on Mount Carmel wants to bring a sacrifice, and it's not in Jerusalem. We have a problem. It's a violation of the law. When can a prophet say, now it's different? The Almighty tells me now we can violate this law. And when is that not allowed? And so on. A very long and fascinating elucidation and explication of prophecy. That will be part 2 of our study, please God, of Rambam's Introduction to Mishnah. In part 1, we learned about the concept of oral Torah, the history, the origin of oral Torah, the way it was done in times of Moshe, and the systems set in place to ensure that it is maintained and perpetuated accurately, namely that of the Sanhedrin, to adjudicate the disputes. He will continue, once he finishes talking about prophecy, to proceed in times of Joshua and so on, tracing the history of oral Torah up to the writing of the Mishnah. And again, it's a very long piece. I shied away from doing it because I know how long it is, but maybe it's time. It's time for us to go through this very, very long and very fundamental work of the Rambam, his introduction to the Mishnah. I look forward to, please God, continuing studying this with y'all in good health and in good spirits. Everyone have a wonderful day, a fantastic Shavuos, which is upcoming, essentially tonight. Shavuos, where please God will receive the Torah again, relive that experience. I look forward to your questions, your comments, and your feedback. As always, my email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.